As today is the Qingming festival, we will carry out 2 Dharma practices for the Dharma event. The first one is called emptying the Vajra hell from the very depths, which means that we will use visualization and mantra chanting, including some powerful mantras, to help some of those sentient beings who have fallen into the 3 lower realms. Or even for those who have fallen into the deepest hell, we call it the Vajra hell, and have great difficulty in getting out of it. In fact, we will help them to reduce some of their karmic obstacles, and we will also use some visualization methods to try to lead them out of those realms. And this Dharma practice itself is one of the teaching methods of the 100 peaceful and wrathful deities in the Bardo state, which specifically uses the practice of Dharma for the deceased to help those sentient beings. In addition, we will also perform another ritual Dharma practice of the 100 peaceful and wrathful deities within the bodily mandala in order to help those sentient beings, such that when they were brought out from the evil realms, they could be protected while, at the same time, continuously receiving the merits dedicated by their living relatives. In this way, they can safely accumulate merits until they have enough to enable them to take rebirth in a better place. Because once you lead them out of the 3 lower realms, they should have taken rebirth in the first place. Once they leave a realm, they will experience a transitional period, and so whether the transitional period is long or short is critical. If it is too short, they can only take rebirth according to their own karma and will not have ample time to accumulate enough virtuous karmic rewards. If in their own karmic portfolio, there are too many evil karmas that appear before the virtuous karmas, though we might have just saved them through our great efforts in practicing the holy Dharma for the deceased, yet it will not be long before they would rapidly fall back into one of the 3 lower realms basing upon their own negative karmas. Therefore, we have to carry out 2 Dharma practices. The first is to save them, and the second is to protect them. So, what is the best Dharma practice to help them? That is the ritual of the 100 peaceful and wrathful deities within the bodily mandala, which can protect these sentient beings from the outset by connecting them with all the 100 peaceful and wrathful deities, which are all of the 100 Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the most powerful ones in this universe who are totally dedicated in saving sentient beings. They will help to create a protection network to protect these sentient beings such that those evil karmas of their karmic portfolio will not emerge so quickly. Meanwhile, the appearance of their virtuous karmas can be triggered. In this way, they can gradually accumulate merits through their Dharma practices. As their loved ones, you should also plant more merits and dedicate these merits to them so that they can receive merits continuously. This is why our Dojon Buddhist Association International will always dedicate the merits in every Dharma event to all of the tablets of the lotus seats for the deceased that were placed in our association. Even if you do not make any lamp offerings in the names during the Qingming festival, neither do you make any smoke offerings in the names during our Dharma events, we will still dedicate all the merits to them, so long as they have their tablets of the lotus seats for the deceased placed over here. Why do we do this? This is to ensure that all the merits of Dharma teachings we have given, of any Dharma events we have done, or of any offerings to Buddhas and Bodhisattvas we have made, will be continuously dedicated to them all. In this way, they can gradually accumulate merits until there are enough merits to enable them to take rebirth in a better place. Their transitional period can then be extended a little bit longer, and so, it would not be in such a great hurry. However, while just basing upon their own negative karmas, they would be trapped in the 3 lower realms in a split second. As such, you would have to put a lot of efforts in order to rescue them again, simply because they would be trapped in the 3 lower realms again and again. Hence, this is a very important direction and method for us to thoroughly help our deceased relatives. If you said that you have not only placed a tablet of the lotus seats for the deceased over here for your deceased relatives, but also make lamp offerings in their names for today's Qingming festival, that would be even better. The reason is that if you make more lamp offerings in the names, you can dedicate more merits to them directly, because all the money that you have donated will all be used for the purpose of propagating the Buddhist holy Dharma. Every merit that will be planted by the propagation of the Buddhist holy Dharma, such as those resulting from the salvation of sentient beings, will be dedicated to them. and they will all share these merits. So, if you say you have done both, not only you have placed the tablets of the lotus seats for the deceased for your ancestors, but also you have offered lamps for them during the Qingming festival. Then, it actually means that you have accumulated merits much more, thicker, and faster for them. There would not be any duplication. In fact, it would be even better. So, these are the 2 Dharma practices we will carry out today, both of which will take a long time. In the first part, we will lead you to practice a lamp offering ritual called 100 Peaceful and Wrathful Deities. Even for people like you who are still alive, this ritual can also help you to be connected with all the 100 peaceful and wrathful deities, namely, the most powerful Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, thus creating a protection network for all of you. Therefore, we will teach everyone, whether they are still alive, or have already passed away, to carry out this Dharma practice. So, in the first half of today's Dharma event, we will teach you how to perform the lamp offering ritual to help you to practice the visualization and be connected with the 100 peaceful and wrathful deities. After that, we will take a break, and then we will practice the sadhana on emptying the Vajra hell from their very depths, to be followed by another sadhana called the 100 peaceful and wrathful deities within the bodily mandala in order to protect them. Since we need to carry out 3 Dharma practices in total today, it will take quite a long time. Therefore, by today's lecture on the visualization practice of compassion and bodhicitta series 7 will be a bit briefer, so that we can have more time for the 3 Dharma practices. I will now start to talk about the 7th session of the series. We have already explained the first session, which is about the correct explanation of the bodhicitta of emptiness, oral pith instructions on the great perfection, and the fallacies of the crazy wisdom. This episode has already been uploaded to our Dojom Buddhist Association International TV channel on YouTube. The second session is about the visualization method of initiating the programming in entering into the Dharma realm to attain Buddhahood. Remember to watch it again, because this is the episode in which we have formally started the explanation on the visualization method. Thus, it will be better for you watch the whole series again from the first episode. The third session is about the oral pith instructions in attaining the Dharmakaya Buddha of the teachings on the key of life and death. The fourth session is about the teachings on the key of life and death too. The oral pith instructions in attaining the Sambhogakaya Buddha, and the oral pith instructions and detailed explanation of the visualization practice on Heart Sutra. The fifth session is about the teachings on the key of life and death 3. The oral pith instructions in attaining the Nirmanakaya Buddha, as well as a comparison on the oral pith instructions of the visualization practices between the Great Perfection and the Heart Sutra. And the 6th episode of the series was just explained in the last session, which is on the comparisons among the oral pith instructions of the visualization practices in the daily life by the Heart Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, and the Great Perfection. Today is the 7th session, which is about the oral pith instructions of the visualization practice on the nature of the 5 aggregates as emptiness of the Heart Sutra. Well, in fact, the Heart Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, and the Great Perfection will be slowly explained in details and in depth together. You do not have to worry that there will be no more in-depth explanations or teachings on visualization practice, just because we have already explained some important contents of the Heart Sutra before. In fact, we will continue to talk about it and go deeper and deeper, hoping that it can be applied in our daily life to help us in our visualization practice. We have already said that without compassion, one cannot be reborn in the Buddha's Pure Lands. Compassion is divided into mercy and pity. What are they? Mercy is to give others happiness. Pity is to relieve and remove the sufferings of others. Many people are born with a certain degree of compassion, but in fact they have lost a lot of the compassion they should have. We must use this compassion to practice bodhicitta, for we cannot attain Buddhahood without bodhicitta. If we cannot attain Buddhahood, we will not be able to escape from the tidal sea of sorrow, being trapped in the cycle of karmic existence forever. So what exactly is bodhicitta? Bodhicitta is the intrinsic awareness of perfect enlightenment, which is very difficult to recover. Therefore, we have to split it into relative bodhicitta and absolute bodhicitta, the latter of which is the most thorough and supreme, bodhicitta, which is the perfect enlightenment. The relative bodhicitta can be further divided into bodhicitta of aspiration, or aspirational bodhicitta, and bodhicitta of action, or action bodhicitta. So long as you are willing to make a vow that you practice the holy Dharma in order to save all sentient beings and not just to save yourselves, then you do not require 3 great asimhaya kalpas to succeed. If you say, "No, I do not wish to be so compassionate. I just want to be an Arhat," but Arhats cannot enter the Dharma realm, and they cannot become a true Dharmakaya Buddha. As such, they still have their shortcomings. Therefore, we must do the most thorough, and thus we have to make a vow so that we can truly help ourselves. Bodhicitta of action means that we are to receive and observe of bodhisattva precepts, and undertake all kinds of behavioral actions that will benefit both ourselves and others. Then we must further act in complementary with precepts, meditative concentration, and wisdom, which means that we have to keep some precepts. We have to cultivate a certain degree of meditational power, and at the same time we have to develop some wisdom. Then we must adopt a balanced approach to practice the holy Dharma so that we can enter into the state of emptiness, neither existence nor voidness. Only in this way can we arouse the crystal clarity of our intrinsic awareness, or Rigpa in Tibetan. The crystal clarity of our intrinsic awareness refers to the kind of awareness which is free from any deviations or attachments, and has restored to the state of perfect enlightenment. This is called the true and genuine bodhicitta. Say we do not practice this 5th step, which is the most thorough bodhicitta, but only practice the ordinary compassion, namely, mercy and pity, which is a common feature of all ordinary religions, including all non-Buddhist religions. And then if we proceed to the 3rd and 4th steps of practicing the relative bodhicitta, that is, with all our Dharma practices linked to the worldly daily affairs, but without going further to practice on the visualization methods of how to enter into the Dharma realm, that is, without the 5th step, then it will take us 2 to 3 great asimhaya kalpas, which is an infinitely long period of time, to practice. But, in fact, in the middle of the journey, you may have fallen into the 3 lower realms, which means that you will never be able to succeed in your Dharma practice, and you will never be able to be liberated from the cycle of karmic existence. Therefore, it is actually a very impractical and dangerous path of Dharma practice. Hence, we must practice all together from the 1st step all the way up to the 5th step, given that the 5th step of the absolute bodhicitta is extremely important. You may say, "I do not want to attain Buddhahood. As long as I can enter into the Buddha's pure lands, I am already satisfied, and would not ask for too much." But the problem lies in the fact that even if you successfully go to the Buddha's pure lands through very hard practice, but actually in the end, everything will become disillusioned eventually. And thus, after a long period of time, everything will be perished, and you will inevitably fall out of the pure lands too. So, in fact, this is not a thorough way that can really help you. What can help you most is that you can restore back your perfect enlightenment, and then you will be able to enter into the Dharma realm, which means that you will be able to become formally liberated from the control of samsara. That will be the time when you will regain back all your great abilities. You can then choose to stay in the Dharma realm, or return back to the 3 realms, so as to save all sentient beings, as well as of all your relatives and friends in your past lives. It will turn out to be the best way for you. So how can we practice all together from the 1st step all the way up to the 5th step? We can divide the 24 hours of a day into 3 stages for our visualization practice. The first stage is when we are in the state of waking up or emerging from meditation, or during a session of meditative concentration. We treat this stage as a moment when we are about to enter into the Dharma realm, and so we have to learn how to initiate the programming in entering into the Dharma realm, which has already been explained in the 1st to 5th episodes. Starting from the 6th episode, we have begun to teach how we can practice in our daily life or in dreams, that is, when we are in the 3 realms, how we would receive training, so that we can undertake some actual practices in the programming of restoring our bodhicitta. If we do not train hard in our daily life but only practice when we sleep and at the moment we wake up, or we just practice during formal meditation sessions and when we enter the meditative state, then in fact we will still face many obstacles and difficulties, as well as lack of proficiency. Because we are actually immersed in our daily life for the longest time, but it is also the time when we are facing most of the impacts. And so we must get used to the way of how to practice Dharma in our daily life. Therein lies the problem. There are simply too many blows in our daily life. If you want to visualize on the kind of bodhicitta and awareness, you will find that there is a conflict in it, which makes it quite difficult to grasp. That is why we have to read so many sutras in order to master the keys for our Dharma practice, because it is actually really difficult to do so. We are going to explain this now. If we can practice well, we can restore back our intrinsic nature, also known as Buddha nature, or Dharma nature, which is a kind of intrinsic awareness of perfect enlightenment that we originally possess. We call this intrinsic awareness of perfect enlightenment as bodhicitta, the recovery of which can help us to become liberated from the cycle of karmic existence and be freed from all restraints. And that means we would be able to attain Buddhahood. Well, if it is about how to initiate the programming in entering into the Dharma realm, we will quote the Heart Sutra to explain it. But if we talk about how to practice the programming of this bodhicitta in our daily life, we will use the Diamond Sutra to explain it. Why is there such a difference? We will explain in details later. Today is our second session on the Diamond Sutra. In the previous session, we have talked about the elder Subhuti who had asked the Lord Buddha Shakyamuni a question which begins with virtuous men, virtuous women. And the Lord Buddha Shakyamuni also replied to begin with virtuous men, virtuous women. Here you need to pay attention that virtuous men, virtuous women is referring to either a man or a woman, regardless of their gender. In other words, he did not mean that only men can do it while women cannot, nor only women can do it while men cannot. Neither did he mean that only Buddhas and Bodhisattvas can do it. None of these. In short, any man or woman, as long as they resolve to attain the Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi. Anuttara means unsurpassed, that is, nothing is better or greater than it. Samyak means well balanced and equally abiding, that is, without any deviations. Sambodhi means complete and perfect enlightenment, that is, the intrinsic awareness, that is, without any deviations. So the explanation of the whole phrase is unsurpassed, well balanced and equally abiding, complete and perfect enlightenment, or perfect enlightenment, in abbreviated form, which means the attainment of Buddhahood. In other words, we need to restore our intrinsic awareness without any deviations, which is the absolute bodhicitta that we are talking about now. Why do I keep repeating this over and over again? Because I have found that many people do not know that bodhicitta is a kind of awareness, and that this awareness actually refers to the intrinsic awareness of perfect enlightenment, which is absolutely without any deviations. So they often confuse bodhicitta and compassion, thinking that as long as they do something merciful, it means they have bodhicitta. In fact, this is still very far from bodhicitta. But why must we know about this? Because if you do not know about this, you will not know that you still have room for improvement. As a result, you will only stagnate and never succeed in your Dharma practice. So we must know that absolute bodhicitta is indeed perfect enlightenment. We must succeed in practicing it, the fifth step, so that we can really help ourselves. The problem is that it is very difficult for us to restore this intrinsic awareness of perfect enlightenment in order to help ourselves. In my entire daily life, all I think about is going to work or taking care of my loved ones. Thus, how do I have free time to think about things like these, how to restore my intrinsic awareness? In fact, is it possible for us to succeed in our Dharma practice when we are in the process of caring for relatives and working? In other words, how can we be able to succeed in training our mind? Therefore, the elder Subhuti asked, "My Lord Buddha, if anyone makes a vow to restore this bodhicitta, their intrinsic awareness, then they can save themselves and attain Buddhahood. But the question is, how should their minds be abiding by? So, where should we abide by? Where should our mind abide by? What should we do? Where should this mind always abide by without retreating, in order to enable us to succeed in our Dharma practice? Thus, where should we abide by? Elder Subhuti continued to ask, how should their thoughts be subdued? How could we eliminate those deluded thoughts in our minds so as not to have so many deluded thoughts? Because our minds may not always be thinking about how to restore our intrinsic awareness. We would usually only think about how to live and take care of our own 3 meals, and to worry about having no place to live and no food to eat. How could these two kinds of matters coexist? How to subdue those useless thoughts so that they will not harass and hinder us? He was asking this question to the Lord Buddha Shakyamuni. In our daily life, how should we train our minds so as to enable us to accomplish the attainment of this bodhicitta, that is, to attain Buddhahood? He was actually asking this question, which was, indeed, a very important question. So how did we explain the answer to this question before? This is how we explained it. If we want to subdue our own mind, it is equivalent to not being attached to any notions, appearances or forms, or thinkings, or views. This mind here refers to the mind that having that deluding thoughts. By not clinging to any notions, appearances or forms, or thinkings, or views, then we can subdue our own deluded thoughts of our own minds. As we mentioned in the last session, if you manage to do this, it means that you can realize and know that all the deluded thoughts are temporary displays of the Dharma nature, all of which do not have any unchanging and eternal notion, appearance, or form. You may then wonder, how can I not be attached to such notions, appearances or forms, or thinkings, or views? When you look at something in depth, you realize and know that it is merely a temporary display of the Dharma nature, not something that is eternal and unchanging. As long as you see things on this level, and you are willing to think more deeply about things on this level. At the same time, when you look at something in greater details and know that it is only a temporary display of the Dharma nature, then you can already begin to enter into the door of subduing your mind. You have started to succeed because you have already known where the key is. The key is actually right here. Well, that means this is actually an oral pith instruction. So, how to formally deepen it further? It is necessary for us to apply a visualization practice method known as emptiness, neither existence nor voidness. In a moment, we will quote the Heart Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, and the Great Perfection to explain this emptiness, neither existence nor voidness. In fact, how should we practice it? What exactly is it? These will be further explained in greater details. If we understand these, it means that we can begin to slowly master the visualization practices of compassion and bodhicitta in our daily life. Okay, the previous paragraph is where we explained in the last session. Today, we will continue from where we left off in the following paragraph. This is what the Diamond Sutra taught. The Lord Buddha Shakyamuni said to the elder Subhuti, for those bodhisattvas with enlightened intentions to practice the holy Dharma. What does this really mean? Bodhisattva means realizing and understanding. What is realizing and understanding? The moment when you make the vow saying, I am determined to attain Buddhahood. I am determined to restore my own bodhicitta. At this very moment, you are already realizing and understanding. Because you are now realizing and understanding, you can then be called as a bodhisattva. Bodhisattva means realizing and understanding. In other words, you have finally awakened from the illusions. You have finally come to understand that you should make this vow in order to attain Buddhahood, and to be liberated from this cycle of karmic existence. It is this realizing and understanding, which can be known as for those bodhisattvas with enlightened intentions to practice the holy Dharma. In other words, once we are realizing and understanding, we want to focus on some Dharma practices in order to attain Buddhahood. Then, what should we do? For all practitioners who want to practice Dharma to achieve realizing and understanding, that is, to attain Buddhahood, or to restore the perfect enlightenment, or absolute bodhicitta, what should they do? Should not abide anywhere. It means they should not stay and cling to anywhere. That is to say, once you are realizing and understanding. When you want to practice Dharma in your daily life, but you have to keep a mindset called should not abide anywhere while facing all the things in your daily life. In our daily life there should not be anything that makes you stay there. That is, you should not constantly be attached to thinking about it, while thinking over and over again but still would not be willing to let go of it. Or clinging onto it so as to do a certain behavior and not willing to let go. If you can really manage to do this, then you can be called as an awakening bodhisattva, who is formally practicing the holy Dharma. That is to say, this is a method of visualization practice on the nature of the mind, which is a method that can help our nature of mind to restore the perfect enlightenment or absolute bodhicitta of the state of oneness. Well, the Lord Buddha Shakyamuni did give an example when they take actions in almsgiving. For example, if you want to give alms, how should you do it? Although almsgiving is considered to be an act of practicing Dharma in daily life, you still should not abide anywhere. Do not think that as long as the deeds you do in daily life are good ones, it does not matter whether you are attached to them. I must do more good deeds, it does not matter if I am attached to them. I will not do bad deeds. I understand that we should not be attached to doing bad deeds, but why can we not even be attached to doing good deeds? I will explain it shortly. In fact, even for virtuous karmas or merits like almsgiving, we should not abide anywhere. This is indeed the correct method to carry out the visualization practice of compassion and bodhicitta in our daily lives. Okay, how can we use this kind of visualization practice on the nature of the mind to perform almsgiving? What is not to abide with almsgiving in forms or substances? The Lord Buddha Shakyamuni continued. How can we apply this of should not abide anywhere in our virtuous acts such as almsgiving? How to apply it to the virtuous acts that we perform in our daily lives? What the Lord Buddha said is that we should not abide with almsgiving in forms or substances. That is, we should not be attached to the almsgiving in forms, namely, material substances, or to the almsgiving in the appearance of any scenes that our eyes see. At the same time, you must not abide in, that is, not be attached to all the almsgivings with sounds, odors, tastes, tactile sensations, and all phenomena, namely, all circumstances of scenes. You must not be attached to all of these. Why did the Lord Buddha Shakyamuni mention all of these forms, sounds, odors, tastes, tactile sensations, and phenomena? What exactly are them? Why did he mention these things when he said that we should apply the principle of should not abide anywhere in daily life? It turns out that we call these 6 things, 6 dusts. 6 dusts are just like dust, they are polluting, very subtle, and all over the space. So we call them 6 dusts. They are 6 kinds of pollutants that contain and trigger our greed, hatred, and ignorance. But there are so many of them that they are all over the empty space, and they are really subtle, so we call them 6 dusts. What are they exactly? We call them form dust, sound dust, odor dust, taste dust, tactile sensation dust, and phenomena dust. How do we explain them? Because these 6 things are like 6 thieves, which will trigger our greed, hatred, and ignorance, and can steal away all the intrinsic awareness of our compassion and bodhicitta. Therefore, we call them thieves, but they are actually 6 dusts. Then how do we get polluted by these 6 kinds of dust? Through our eyes we see many physical forms, or some scenes. We see through our eyes, so we call them a sense organ or a root, and through this root, we are able to see the form dust. We use our ears to catch these sound dust, that is, those sound pollutants. Because we smell fragrances through our noses, and fragrances are actually some pollutants, and so we sometimes cling to them, we are thus polluted by the odor dust, namely, the scent pollutants through the nose. Tongue, we use it to taste. We use the tongue to perceive taste, which we call it taste dust, meaning that we would be attached to this kind of taste. Body, we will touch something through the body, to come into contact with this tactile sensation dust, which will also make us develop some attachments. Mind, it means the brain, where we generate our consciousness. This brain is also an organ that let us attach to all those judgments and consciousness that had arisen when we are exposed to all phenomena or scenes. We give these 6 sense organs a name, 6 roots. It is these 6 organs that allow us to come into contact with these 6 dusts, the 6 kinds of pollutants. Okay, but in fact, our eyes have a function called eye consciousness. We can only use our eyes according to their function. Our eyes are made of material substances. In fact, they must have a function to be able to formally collect all the dusts on some forms or images of all material substances, namely, the form dust, to distinguish them. We call it eye consciousness, the function of the eyes. As for the ears, we call it ear consciousness, which is the function of the ears. The function of the nose is called nose consciousness. The function of the tongue is called tongue consciousness. The identification function of the body is called body consciousness. The function of generating consciousness in our brains is called mental consciousness. These 6 different functions are collectively known as the 6 consciousness, which simply means 6 functions. Well, when these 6 dusts, 6 sense organs, or 6 roots, and the 6 identification functions, or 6 consciousness, are all combined, it can help us to do a lot of things. For example, from the eye consciousness to the body consciousness, that is, the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and body. It will collect all the information and pass it on to the mental consciousness to make a judgment. After gathering the information, the mental consciousness will make a judgment based on these pieces of information. And then it will generate emotions based on the judgment. The mental consciousness will think about it. The information on this matter will affect me. Is it a good effect or a bad one? Then you will have emotions. Based on these emotions, you will take actions, and according to these actions, you will have karmic forces of causes and effects. Because any behavior you do will not only affect yourselves but also affect other sentient beings. When the mental consciousness of other sentient beings is affected by you, they will respond and rebound. In return, they will also use their own mental consciousness to influence you. As a result, you will be trapped in this group of interrelated mental consciousness, and the karmic force of causes and effects is thus formed. Well, based on these behavioral formulas and programming, our 5 aggregates will be developed. That is to say, everything that arises from our judgments, emotions, actions, to the formation of karmic force of causes and effects, will be stored as certain behavioral formulas and programming in our 5 kinds of aggregate storage. That is, they are placed in 5 warehouses, namely databases of different categories. These are the 5 databases. Aggregate of form, Rupa Skanda. I have explained it before. It is the aggregate storage of all material substances, that is, a database of material information, including the information about some forms or scenes. Aggregate of sensations, Vedana Skanda, the database of feelings. Aggregate of perceptions, Samna Skanda, the database of thoughts. Aggregate of mental formation, Samskara Skanda, the database of behaviors. Aggregate of consciousness, Vijnana Skanda, the database of mental consciousness. All these will be explained in detail shortly. These 5 aggregate storages of habitual accumulations, or known as the 5 accumulated databases, will make us trapped. Okay, let us take a look. What made us have these 5 databases in the first place? We have 6 kinds of dust, and we use our 6 kinds of sense organs and our 6 kinds of identification functions to collect information, which leads to these 5 kinds of habitual databases. In other words, 6 plus 6 plus 6 make a total of 18 kinds. We collectively refer to these 18 kinds as 18 realms. What is a realm? It means a demarcation, a limit, or a boundary line. In other words, it will entangle and constrain you. It draws a circle, and it immediately encircles you, which is equivalent to a kind of limitation. It is these 18 things that have chained us up. Therefore, we usually call them the 18 chains. These are the 18 chains. You must recognize them clearly. The Lord Buddha Shakyamuni often mentioned these as the 18 realms in all his teachings. He often mentioned the 18 realms, such as eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, mind, etc. He kept saying that these are, indeed, the 18 chains that would come to lock you, entangle you, and draw a circle to constrain you. Therefore, you must know about these 18 chains. Otherwise, you will not know how to unlock these chains, because you have no idea that it is these 18 chains that lock you up. If you know these chains, you can unlock them. If you know how to unlock them, then you will know how to further your Dharma practice in order to remove these 5 databases. Only then can you illuminate and perceive the 5 aggregates, and seeing that they are all empty, just as the Heart Sutra says, so that you would be able to enter into the Dharma realm. In other words, you must know the 18 realms well, and that is why I formally introduce them to you now. Okay, so what are the purified 6 roots? Just now I have explained that the 6 sense organs are called 6 roots. If we practice Dharma well and purify these 6 sense organs, in fact, we can achieve the interpenetrations of the 6 roots. What is that? In the Saddharma Pundarika Sutra, and the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, it is stated that if you manage to attain the purified 6 roots, then you can achieve interoperability of the 6 roots. Because when we are born, everyone has already told us, or our own autonomic nervous system has told ourselves about the functions of these 6 organs. The eyes are for seeing things, the nose is for smelling things, and the ears are for hearing things. But it turns out that as long as you know how to use some visualization methods to break through the 18 boundaries formed by these 18 chains, and tell yourselves that the eyes are for listening, the ears are for seeing, the nose is for touching things, and your sense of taste can be used for other things. If you tell yourselves this way, the boundaries and limitations of your mental consciousness will gradually be lifted. Subsequently, you will learn to try to see things with your ears, and you will try to hear things with your eyes. Then, you will be like the Bodhisattva Avalokitesvara, who can use the interpenetrations of the 6 roots to see things with his ears and hear things with his eyes. But in fact, you have to understand, is this kind of supernatural power that we want? Actually, it is not. It is just a side effect. It will automatically appear if your Dharma practice reaches a certain level. You may ask, I have been practicing Dharma all my life, but if this kind of power has not yet appeared at the moment I die, does it mean that I will never be able to enter into the Dharma realm, to restore my bodhicitta, and to attain Buddhahood? That is not the case. Because, in fact, some people concentrate on there and tell themselves all day long, my ears are for seeing things. I want to attain, purify 6 roots, in order to achieve interpenetrations of the 6 roots. Actually, this is also an attachment, which will make you abide in appearance and form. You will abide in the functions or the forms of the sense organs, such as the nose and the eyes. Then you will not succeed in your Dharma practice, you will not be able to enter into the Dharma realm, and your bodhicitta, of the perfect enlightenment, will never be able to be restored. We have therefore said it many times, having supernatural powers does not mean that you can succeed in your Dharma practice. These supernatural powers only help you focus your attention on certain functions of your body to develop and expand their potential, so that they can do a lot of work. This is a completely different matter from whether you can stay in the Dharma realm, whether you can attain Buddhahood, or whether you can restore your intrinsic awareness of perfect enlightenment. Therefore, you might say that you want to attain the purified 6 roots, as everyone else says that one should succeed in attaining the purified 6 roots. Well, this is just that you have misunderstood the purpose of having the purified 6 roots. The meaning of the purified 6 roots is that your 6 roots, or the 6 sense organs, should not abide in or cling onto all the 6 dusts, and thus collect all the useless information, which will cause your mental consciousness to make random judgments. This is the real meaning of the purified 6 roots. Although some people might be able to achieve the interpenetrations of the 6 roots via their Dharma practices, it does not mean that they could restore the bodhicitta, of the perfect enlightenment. I must have to clarify on this point. Well, just now I have explained the 6 steps procedure upon which we would collect information, all the way to the accumulation of those databases, so as to make ourselves being trapped in the 3 realms. That is to say, this 6 steps procedure is the major hindrance that will prevent us from being liberated from samsara, and in attaining Buddhahood. Sometimes you will see a proper noun in Buddhist scriptures known as the 12 sense fields. What does it mean? It means that if 6 dusts, 6 kinds of pollutants, together with the 6 roots, 6 sense organs, which make up a total of 12. Thus, we would collectively refer to them as the 12 sense fields. These 12 sense fields, through the 6 functions, will cause us to become polluted by greed, hatred, and ignorance. So, we call them as the 12 sense fields. If the 6 functions are also included, then we will collectively refer to them as the 18 realms, which form the 18 chains, 18 boundaries, or 18 limitations. Okay, now let us review what the scripture says. Bodhisattva should give alms in such a way. It says that bodhisattvas should use this kind of visualization practice on the nature of the mind to perform almsgiving. That is to say, you should not abide in the 6 pollutants, namely, forms, sounds, odors, tastes, tactile sensations, and phenomena while performing almsgiving. You must not link these 6 pollutants to almsgiving, such that you cannot succeed in the practice of intrinsic awareness. Even if you are performing virtuous acts, practicing almsgiving, doing good deeds, or accumulating merits, you must not be involved in these 6 pollutants, that is, the 6 dusts. Do not let yourselves be polluted by these 6 dusts. You have to apply the visualization practice on the nature of the mind in such a way while giving alms. This is what it means. In other words, they should not abide in notions. How to give alms in such a way? In what way? That is, they should not abide in notions. Why is it that one should not abide in notions is equivalent to not abiding in the 6 pollutants? Let me explain it in more details now. One should not abide in notions means that one should not be attached to any kinds of notions, or thinkings, or views which belong to the dualistic and/or multiplistic states. Therefore, the meaning of should not abide anywhere is that you do not abide in any point, such that there is only one point of yours that is remaining. In this way, you will remain in the state of oneness, and this is meant by should not abide anywhere. That is to say, these 2 sentences in this whole passage are, indeed, the oral pith instructions of the whole scripture, one of which is, should not abide anywhere, which is about the state of oneness. You have only one point. You will not abide in any other thing of more than one point, and so you'll remain to have one point. So, what is this point? It is the realizing and knowing of oneness. You only have this state of oneness. Should not abide in notions is a way to teach you how to maintain your state of oneness. That is, if you do not abide in notions, you can then maintain your state of oneness. So, what is meant by should not abide in notions? Do not cling on to, abide in, or dwell upon any notions or thinkings. In this way, you can do it. But how to put it into practice? When I cross the road, if I see a car rushing towards me, does that mean I should just ignore it? Does this mean that I should not abide in notions? How do we deal with situations like this? How should we practice this oral pith instruction of visualization practice? Let us have a deeper understanding of these 18 realms. I have just explained these 18 realms, which are the 6 dusts plus the 6 roots plus the 6 consciousnesses. So, how do these 18 realms, or the 18 chains, operate to lock us up? Their first step is to collect information, which will then be stored in the database. Then, they will search the existing databases to see if there is any corresponding information, which will then be contrasted with the newly collected information. If there is, this new information will be added onto the old ones, and will then be passed on together to our mental consciousness for making a judgment. We will thus make a judgment on those pieces of information. After we have judged upon those pieces of information, we will put them into our 5 aggregates. In this way, some new information will be added into our 5 aggregates, in such a way that some old information is being retrieved to be used. Probably also being filtered by us, while some others were being discarded, with some more to be modified, and some to be used. As such, the 5 aggregates, namely, the 5 databases, are involved, which I have explained earlier, and we will go through them again. They include the aggregate of form Rupa Skandha, the aggregate of sensations Vedana Skandha, the aggregate of perceptions Samna Skandha, the aggregate of mental formation Samskara Skandha, and the aggregate of consciousness Vijnana Skandha. What is the aggregative form, or rupa skandha? Maybe let me explain it a little bit in more details. Rupa refers to all shapes and forms. Rupa is actually equal to material substances. What is a substance? It is composed of the four most basic elements: earth, water, fire, and wind. It can be some very, very, very fine particles. For example, some people in the scientific community now say that the smallest particles should be called quarks. But some scientists do not agree with this. They believe that quarks are not the smallest, and there are some particles even smaller than quarks. That is to say, scientists are still tracing how these substances are formed from the smallest particles at the beginning. What are these smallest particles? What is their shape? How are these smallest particles stacked together like building blocks, and then molecules and atoms are connected together by a kind of mutual gravitational force? In other words, these substances are formed from the smallest particles which are gradually stacked together like building blocks. Their most basic elements are earth, water, fire, and wind. And there is a kind of gravitational force in them. These substances have a gravitation, without which their atoms and molecules are very difficult to move. In other words, they are gravitational to each other, and they are stacked like building blocks, but the building blocks will not collapse. But will they never collapse? No, they will collapse sooner or later. They will collapse if they are stacked up continuously until they can no longer bear the load. When these substances collapse, they will dissolve. After dissolution, they will reorganize. That is how it goes. So what do all these shapes and forms include? They are the shapes and forms or scenes produced by these, including forms, namely, material substances, sounds, odors, taste, tactile sensations, and all scenes and all phenomena. All these are included in the aggregative form, or rupa skandha. And they are just different ways of manifestations of a material substance. Also, there are new and old databases of these forms and shapes. You have accumulated a lot of old databases there through your countless past lives, and you are now constantly collecting and adding new databases in this very lifetime. For the searching and recognition of all the forms and shapes, it often begins like this. There is a core teaching in our Buddhism, which is about everything comes from the mind. How exactly do these substances come from our minds? In fact, the formation of these substances is due to deviations that have arisen in our minds at the very beginning. As a result of this deviation of the mind, a kind of gravitation is created. This kind of gravitation will attract some very, very fine particles or the like, so fine that even today's scientists do not know what exactly their names should be. In short, they are the finest particles, which Buddhism calls the fine motes of dust. They are so fine that they can be pulled towards you with the slightest pull of your gravitation. After being pulled together, these fine motes of dust will stack like building blocks to build up the scenes that your minds would want him to appear, in accordance to the gravitational forces of your minds. The problem is that there are so many sentient beings, and yet every sentient being has its own mental consciousness in existence. In this way, it is not just an individual's own mental consciousness that determine the outcomes of everything comes from the mind in creating substances, but that all other sentient beings also participate in this whole process to agglomerate substances with their own mental strengths. So, this explains why we do not have an autonomy of our own. Although our own minds actually wish that we can be more good-looking, but in reality we may be reborn to become very ugly. Why is that? It is because although we would very much wish to agglomerate a very attractive physical body, but if the evil karmas in our karmic portfolios account for a greater proportion than the virtuous karmas, we would then pull some negative substances together. At the same time, our karmic creditors are also trying to influence us with their mental strengths as well. Hence, it would cause us to further pull more negative substances. So, when aggregating them together, our appearance would become ugly. This shows that for our respective aggregates of form, that is, all the forms and shapes or the aggregation of the material substances of ourselves, we actually do not have any autonomy upon them. Simply put it, they are unreal, and they change all the time. As long as any of your karmic creditors changes their thoughts, or that you change your own thoughts, your appearance will also change. We call this as physiognomy comes from the mind. Or that our appearance would also change after a serious illness. Everything is impermanent. In other words, this aggregate of form, with everything inside this database, is constantly ever-changing. Therefore, we say that it is unreal, and it is not eternal. Alright, but it would trigger our greed, hatred, and ignorance as well. It is the source of all our greed, hatred, and ignorance. Therefore, the oral pith instruction of the Diamond Sutra says, 1. Should not abide in notions. Since this is the source, if I do not abide in, dwell upon, or cling on to all the forms or appearances that were formed by all material substances, whether it is a scene, or a form or appearance, formed by the elements of earth, water, fire, and wind, so long as I should not abide in notions, then I can cut off this very source. Why do we say it is the source? In fact, most of the sentient beings, especially those living in the desire realm, such as us the human beings, usually have a kind of feeling induced through some forms and appearances, or forms and shapes of some material substances. And then the database of such kind of feeling induced is called the aggregate of sensations, Vedana Skanda. This kind of feeling refers to all sorts of feelings. So, the aggregate of sensations is the database of all feelings. For all the forms or appearances, scenes, or things that we see, we usually look for the relevant information in the database of their forms and shapes, namely, the aggregate of form, basing upon what we have seen. Subsequently, we begin to have our own feelings induced. We will then go to the aggregate of sensations, namely, the database for feelings, to search for relevant feelings based on the information of these forms and shapes. Let me give you an example. Someone slapped you. The scene where you were slapped is called the aggregate of form. How did you feel when you were slapped? Your body would immediately feel a tactile sensation, which was pain. So, it would also immediately look for other relevant information. After finding the relevant information, you were thinking, she slapped me. Should I be angry or happy? Usually we are sure to be angry, but sometimes we may be happy. It turned out that she was the person you admire. She slapped you gently just to flirt with you, so you felt very happy instead. You had been chasing her for a long time, but she always ignored you. Now she was finally willing to pay attention to you and slapped you, so you were very happy. This might be the result of your finding and matching of all the relevant information in all your other databases, which made you think that you should be happy. However, if this was your enemy who slapped you very hard and yet unreasonably, then you would be very angry instead. So this is how you would look for the relevant information in your databases, to let your mental consciousness decide whether you should be angry or not, and whether you should be happy or painful. This results in the formation of the aggregate of sensations. Then your aggregate of sensations will look for further information in its database. So whether you will be happier or more painful will be determined basing upon the information found in all these databases. These situations will accumulate to become a very complicated database of feelings, including all the old and recent grudges, all the old and new loved ones, and it is all there. As a result, more and more greed, hatred, and ignorance have been induced, which will then further reinforce our greed, hatred, and ignorance. Moreover, our aggregates of sensations will thus continue to grow in size and in strength. But how is the aggregate of sensations usually formed, especially in our desire realm? Its formation usually originates from the aggregate of form. That is, when I see a certain form or appearance, I look for its relevant information in the database, and then I decide how I feel. In other words, the aggregate of form, namely, all forms and shapes, is the source of greed, hatred, and ignorance. Therefore, we must ensure that we do not abide in notions or forms or appearances, so that we can cut off the source first. Otherwise, we will follow this form or shape to arouse our many feelings. Because we will go to different databases to find different things. Next, our feelings will trigger our aggregates of perceptions, or samna skanda. The aggregate of perceptions is the database of thoughts. According to these feelings, of course, these databases influence each other, including the aggregate of mental formation, or samskara skandha, and aggregate of consciousness, or vijnana skandha, that will be discussed later. These are mutual influences, not separate unidirectional influences. Okay, then according to the database of these feelings, we will look for relevant desires in the database of our thinkings, namely, the aggregate of perceptions. I found it. I was slapped by this woman. It is worth it because I chased her for a long time. She slapped me, which means she finally paid attention to me. I am so happy. We will look for the relevant desires in the database of the thoughts of these desires, and so we will continue to think. We will seek and conceive some effective ways to enable us to realize our thoughts of these desires, and we will follow them to plan everything. This is called the aggregate of perceptions, or samna skandha. This is the database of thoughts, and we will have new ones as well as old ones. The latest database is the one that I was slapped by her. After finding the relevant information, I then continued to think, plan and organize. She is finally willing to pay attention to me. Should I pursue her even harder to win her heart? As a result, a database of more complex ideas will be accumulated, which will further reinforce and increase our greed, hatred, and ignorance. Well, that is to say, the aggregate of perceptions is actually some thinking and thoughts of desires and some planning ideas, both of which are triggered by all kinds of feelings. Can the aggregate of perceptions work alone? Yes, it can. At times we may suddenly think of a certain situation. Oh, I am so painful. The scene that happened on that day was that I broke up with someone. I was dumped in a nasty way. I never felt so humiliated back then because many people made fun of me. Whenever I think of this scene, I will suffer terribly, and I will cry. Or whenever I think about the death of one of my relatives, I still cannot cope with the grief. Whenever I think of the way he died, I still feel very sad and cry. These are some feelings caused by the aggregate of perceptions itself while looking for some insoluble knots of one's own thinking within one's database. In other words, it is not necessarily the aggregate of form that leads to the aggregate of sensations. The aggregate of sensations may be solely caused by some of your own thinking and thoughts, which may itself be the source. But generally speaking, most of the sources come from material substances, given that we are in the desire realm. Therefore, the oral pith instruction of do not abide in notions not only refers to forms or appearances but also refers to thinking and thoughts of our own, which are also the source that we must stop and not abide in. As such, the oral pith instruction of do not abide in notions is not only to be applied to the aggregate of form, but also to the aggregate of perceptions. Well, the aggregate of mental formation, samskara skandha, is our behavior. Based on the database of all our thinking and thoughts, we will search the database for some related behavioral formula and programming, that is, the aggregate of mental formation is searching from the database of behavior. For example, let me see if there are any books about pursuing girls, explaining what to do to be successful and what will lead to failure. So you will search in the database and decide your behavioral formula and programming as to what to do next. Then you will decide what to do, and then you will actually do it. You will formally execute this behavior. As a result, a new database of more complex behavioral formulas and programming will be accumulated, which include both new causes and old karmas. The old karmas caused by some tractions of previous behaviors, that is, the old behavioral formula and programming, together with some new causes which have made some changes to your existing behavioral formula and programming, will form a new kind of database of your behavior. That is to say, those actual behaviors that are triggered by all the thinking and thoughts are what we call the aggregate of mental formation, or samskara skandha. The next one is the aggregate of consciousness, or vijnana skandha, a database of our mental consciousness. Based on the database of all behaviors, these behaviors include those of the body, speech, and mind. The actions that our bodies have done, the words that our mouths have spoken, and even the things that our minds have thought about, namely, the aggregate of perceptions, are all included in this aggregate of consciousness. Besides, our feeling is also considered a kind of our behavior, meaning that the aggregate of sensations is also included. Moreover, some forms and shapes that have appeared in our aggregates of form will have some tractional forces. I have said before that all substances have a kind of gravitation, they will also be included. All of these are a kind of behavior of body, speech, and mind. All of these databases, and the things contained in them, together with all those mentioned earlier, will search for the relevant database of the mental consciousness. Based upon the past actions, we will incorporate the relevant information into the behavioral formulas and programming, including the karmic forces of causes and effects. In this way, we will accumulate a holistic database of a more complex mental consciousness, including all the new and old karmas together. Let me give you an example. Why is it said that our aggregates of form will affect our aggregates of perceptions, or that our 5 kinds of aggregates will affect each other? It is said that basing upon what we have done in the database of all our behaviors of body, speech, and mind, our aggregates of consciousness will then make relevant changes within its own database in accordance to its accumulated judgments. Let me give you an example. Material substances are actually a kind of tractional force. There was a case in which there was a psychic who had what we commonly call spiritual eyes, or known by the Chinese as yin-yang eyes, that is, he could see ghosts. This was a foreign case, not a Chinese case. Once, the psychic went to a church and saw a ghost walking in circles on the same spot repeatedly. The ghost seemed to be looking for something in a panic, but could not find it after searching for a long time. Because he had psychic abilities, he tried to communicate with the ghost and asked, "What are you looking for? Why do you keep walking in circles? Why don't you leave here? This place seems to have trapped you. You better leave here to take rebirth." The ghost replied him, "There used to be a spiral staircase here. I only need to walk through this staircase, then I can get out of this building. But now I cannot see this staircase, and so I'm being trapped in this building and cannot get out, as if I'm being imprisoned." In other words, what was the reason why he could not be reborn or leave this place? It was because of his aggregate of perceptions. He always remembered in his aggregate of perceptions that there is a spiral staircase. So he kept looking for it. If he could not find it, he could not leave. So, the psychic told him that there was no longer this staircase. He further told the ghost, "In fact, this place used to be an old hospital, not a church. If you look at the previous plan of this building, there used to be a spiral staircase, but it has now been demolished. Now this building has been converted into a church, which no longer has this staircase. If you really have to find this staircase before you can leave here, then you will never be able to leave. You might as well give up the thought about this staircase. Stop thinking about it. As long as you think that you can leave this building, then you can really leave this. But if you think that you must find this spiral staircase in order to leave this building, then you will be trapped here forever, and you will never get out." The question is, why did this phenomenon happen to this ghost? Was it just his aggregate of perceptions, namely, the thinking and thoughts on this spiral staircase, that was trapping him? In fact, it was more than that. The aggregate of form, namely, the material substance itself, also exerted an influence upon him. As I have said before, all material substances have a kind of gravitation. Now that not the entire building was totally demolished. In fact, it would be a different case if the entire building was demolished, as by then the magnetic field of its entire gravitational structure would be dissipated. In this case, this building would still be able to trap these so-called souls, which we call as the bodies of the bardo in Buddhism. The body of the bardo is a state during a transitional period, in which they were still not being able to take rebirth, and from which they could not escape the distress caused by such tractional forces. If any body of the bardo is trapped in a building in this way, they must be able to get out of the building before they can take rebirth again. Otherwise, they will become ghosts over time. This is why he became a ghost at that time. He might even stay in this building as a ghost for thousands of years. Only when the building disappears, the entire magnetic field dissipates, can he escape this tractional force. Indeed, could it be merely the force of the aggregate of perceptions to be able to trap this sentient being? No, there was also the force of the aggregate of form. That was because only the staircase of that building was demolished, and thus the tractional force of that staircase was gone. But, then, the tractional force of the whole building was still controlling him, so he could not find the exit of the building to get out. So, was he also being trapped by the aggregate of mental formation, and the aggregate of sensations? Of course this was the case, was there also the aggregate of consciousness to trap him as well? Yes, there was. However, the biggest database that was trapping him was the aggregate of perceptions, because he was so often thinking of the spiral staircase. But he himself liked to keep on walking in circles in search of the staircase, which was also a kind of behavior, and so the aggregate of mental formation was also trapping him as well. His feeling was that he could not find the staircase, and the more he searched for it, the more he became panic, and so his wisdom and awareness could not arise. So he was also being controlled by his aggregate of sensations. His aggregate of sensations, that is, his feeling, was in a high level of anxiety, thereby controlling his awareness, such that he could not find the way out. His consciousness also judged that, I can't be able to find it. I have no idea where did it go, but it must be here somewhere. I must have to find it out. Thus, he kept on looking for it. Therefore, this is why there are a lot of ghosts in old buildings. Why were there so many ghosts in those buildings? Why is there a lot of negative energy? It was because many people had died there and were trapped in those places. They could not get out of those places. It was not that they did not want to leave, but simply because they were unable to leave. Why? It is because of these 5 databases of the 5 aggregates which we call as the 5 warehouses, in which those sentient beings are being trapped. This is the reason. Therefore, we must disband them. If not, we would not be able to be liberated from the cycle of karmic existence. Now we are talking about a ghost being trapped within a building. However, in the eyes of the Lord Buddha Shakyamuni, all of us sentient beings are being trapped in the 3 realms. Neither can we get out of the 3 realms, nor can we enter into the Dharma realm, thus meaning that we can only continue to suffer in samsara. When you look at the ghost in the church, you'll feel sorry for him that he is so miserable. Similarly, when the Lord Buddha Shakyamuni looks at us, he also feels sorry for us for being so miserable. It is exactly the same. Therefore, you have to see that the 5 aggregates actually affect each other. Whenever something happens, it may be that a certain database that affects you the most. For example, 80% of the influence on you comes from one of the 5 aggregates, and the remaining 20% comes from the other 4 aggregates. It might occur in this way. But generally speaking, it is our aggregate of form that affects our aggregate of sensations, which then affects our aggregate of perceptions. Our aggregate of perceptions would then affect our aggregate of mental formation, which in turn also affects our aggregate of consciousness. It is in such a loop that they influence each other continually. This means that the 5 aggregates and the 18 realms are the factors that cause all sentient beings to be trapped within this cycle of karmic existence. They are like a chain linking up each other, which locks up all sentient beings in the cycle of karmic existence as parts of all the tractional forces. In fact, they have a tractional force. At the same time, they are also all the traps, in which it will make you fall into them and cannot escape. So, we can also call these 5 aggregates the 5 warehouses. As for the 18 realms, we can call them as the 18 logistics transportation chains. They are often used to import data and information to, as well as to get data and information from, these warehouses. Just like a logistics chain that continuously transports data and information in and out, thus forming the 5 warehouses. Hence, they are also the 18 kinds of limitations, and the 18 kinds of chains. Well, there is a Chinese proverb that says, to catch the bandits, first catch their ringleader. The most influential aggregate upon us is the aggregate of form. As we live in the desire realm, with 80% of the influence may come from the aggregate of form, while 20% may come from the aggregate of perceptions. It may be the other way round in the spiritual realm, with 80% of the influence may come from the aggregate of perceptions, while 20% may come from the aggregate of form. But now we are still alive, and so the aggregate of form is the most influential one for us. Therefore, if we aim to catch the bandits, first catch their ringleader, whenever we see any notions of shapes or forms, or forms or scenes of any material substances, we must apply a kind of visualization practice method, that is, do not abide in notions. In this way, we can block the source of the aggregate of form, and if we can block it, then the remaining aggregates will no longer be able to appear. We can take a look at this version of the Heart Sutra, as translated by Master Xuanzang. It says, the noble Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva Mahasattva, that is, the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, while practicing deeply on the practice of Prajna Paramita. When the Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva practiced the Dharma to a profound level by which it could enable him to arrive at the other shore, that is, the other shore means the Dharma realm, meaning to enter into the Dharma realm. When he practiced Dharma to the profound level in order to enter into the Dharma realm, illuminate and perceive the five aggregates by seeing that they are all empty, the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara saw and realized clearly that the five aggregates, or the five warehouses, are indeed empty. That is to say, if you do not empty these five warehouses, they will trap you forever, just like the ghost or the body of the bardo, as mentioned earlier, who were being trapped in the building. It was the aggregate of perceptions that have trapped them, and it was also the five aggregates that have trapped them. So, if you wish to enter into the Dharma realm, but then you are still hiding in these five warehouses, how could you possibly stay in the Dharma realm? You will be trapped forever in the three realms. Therefore, why could the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara visualize and perceive that the nature of the five aggregates is emptiness? If he could visualize and perceive this successfully, it means he could enter into the Dharma realm. Hence Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara could attain Buddhahood. Therefore, the Heart Sutra describes what it is like in the Dharma realm. There cannot exist the five aggregates within this realm. These five warehouses must not exist, and they must be restored to their state of oneness, because the nature of the Dharma realm is a state of oneness. How can one enter the state of oneness? That is by the method of neither existence nor voidness. How do we practice it? I will continue to explain it later. However, another version of the Heart Sutra does not mention it in this way. This other version of the Heart Sutra says, as virtuous men and women, regardless of whether male or female. So this does not necessarily refer to the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, but to any male or female being, while practicing the profound level of visualization practice on Prajna Paramita. Which means that while you could practice some Dharma methods that could enable you to enter into the Dharma realm. Then, what is this method? And how to enter into the Dharma realm? What method is being used? The method is that one should visualize and perceive the nature of the five aggregates as emptiness. If you want to master this method, you should visualize and perceive the nature of the five aggregates with their essential nature as emptiness. If you can manage to visualize and perceive them all as emptiness, these five warehouses will then return to the state of oneness, and you will have no problem. You will then be able to stay in the Dharma realm. This is talking about the visualization practice method of staying in the Dharma realm. You should visualize and perceive the nature of the five aggregates as emptiness. The five aggregates, that is, the five warehouses, are some virtual states in the dualistic or multiplistic states. In fact, their real essential nature is oneness. As such, we must use the visualization practice method of oneness to restore this perfect enlightenment of the absolute bodhicitta. You will find that the version translated by Master Xuanzang is talking about the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara to illuminate and perceive the five aggregates, thus seeing them all as emptiness. On the other hand, this other version is saying that for any man or woman, so long as he or she can successfully visualize and perceive the nature of the five aggregates as emptiness, he or she can be able to stay in the Dharma realm. Here I think this second version suits us better. Why? Because, virtuous men and women, this means that any one of us can be able to enter the Dharma realm to attain Buddhahood. All of us are just ordinary persons, and we are not the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. Thus, when you look at this version, you will think that you can succeed too, and so you will be very happy. In other words, any man or woman can be able to enter into the Dharma realm, and attain Buddhahood. This is such a good news. Therefore, this is my favorite version and is considered to be the best version. Why? It is about equality. The Buddhist Holy Dharma is all about equality. This passage of the sutra is completely in line with equality, and is not misleading. It does not tell you that only the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara could do it, while it is impossible for you to succeed. No, not at all. In fact, everyone can do it, and so it is not misleading. Furthermore, it is straightforward. It explains directly to you that this is the way of the Buddhist Holy Dharma. Everyone can practice the Holy Dharma, and that anyone who practices it can be able to succeed. This is completely consistent with the true meaning of the Buddhist Holy Dharma. I think this translated version can completely conform to the true principles of the Buddhist Holy Dharma. Then, how should we visualize and practice on the nature of the five aggregates as emptiness? I have already explained the 5 warehouses, that is, those 5 different warehouses. How can we visualize them as emptiness? Firstly, we must visualize and practice on the aggregate of form as emptiness of oneness. We must apply the visualization practice method on do not abide in notions, which means that we will not abide in any notions of forms or appearances. I will not abide in or cling on to any notions of forms or appearances within my realm or my view. In this way, we can be able to restore the state of oneness without being trapped by them. For example, I have talked about the story of beer and beer foam in the last session. When you see beer and beer foam, as long as you do not stir it, and do not continue to keep stirring it. That is, not stirring it, means do not abide in notions. So long as you do not abide in there, and if you do not stir it constantly, the foamy head-on beer will slowly recover to its former state. That is, the beer foam will return back into beer again, and is being restored. Those deluded thoughts are like beer foam. As long as you do not stir the deluded thoughts, that is, as long as you do not abide in notions, then the beer foam will not continue to appear, just as those deluded thoughts will no longer appear, and they will slowly dissipate by themselves. Although you may feel that the speed of their dissipation is very slow, you think it is very slow, but it does not matter. After you get used to it slowly, you would simply let them float freely, and you would not abide in them as if they do not exist at all. Hence, whether they have been reverted back to the intrinsic awareness of the state of oneness is no longer important, simply because you do not abide in them anymore. So long as you do not abide there, then there would not have any problems at all. Secondly, do not search the database for any notions of forms and shapes. For instance, some people often like to abide in certain notions of forms or appearances, such as, I swear that I must go to the Buddha's Pure Lands. Even if I die, I have to keep visualizing what the Buddha Amitabha's Pure Land is like. Or they might abide in the notion of longevity, such as, how should I visualize the yidam? As long as I can manage to visualize the appearance of the yidam, I can be able to enter into the yidam's Buddha field. The notion of longevity is one of the 4 notions that I talked about in the last session, which will make us to abide there and being attached. Do you know that even if any notions of forms such as a pure land, or Buddha field, or any yidam, is still a notion of form or appearance which belongs to the dualistic and or multiplistic state, it will make you to become unable to restore the state of oneness, and will prevent you from entering into or staying inside the Dharma realm. Therefore, if you really want to attain Buddhahood, in order to restore the intrinsic awareness of the bodhicitta, of perfect enlightenment, you must make sure that you do not abide in notions, including the notion of longevity, such as pure lands, yidams, and everything else. When we see these 5 warehouses, do we need to do anything further? Or is it just fine and enough if we do not abide in notions? No, I cannot say that it is just fine and enough so long as I do not abide over there, nor thinking about them. We must add one more profound visualization practice, which will enable you to understand it more deeply, as if you have seen it with your own eyes. That is, these 5 warehouses are all only virtually existing and fictitious. They are in fact illusions, and their very essential nature is emptiness. They are unreal, as if we are watching a movie now. Some people will not fall into the plot of the movie and cry, simply because they know it is unreal. But, then, why did some people fall into the plot of the movie and could not help crying when they saw the protagonist cried? Because they have regarded the virtual things as real, and then connected these things with the aggregates of perceptions, mental formation, consciousness and sensations. They thought that they themselves were the protagonists and thus could not help crying. You might think this is an expression of empathy, whatever it is. So long as they were connected, they would definitely be trapped. So we must remember, we have to go and look more deeper, whether it is watching a movie or looking at those 5 warehouses. We must have to know that they are only virtually existing and fictitious, and we will not be trapped by them. Because their very essential nature is emptiness. Only when you think further and go deeper in this way, it can be regarded as a more profound and in-depth visualization practice of do not abide in notions. You can see directly that their very essential nature is emptiness. They are not eternally existent, they are only existing temporarily in the dualistic and/or multiplistic states. They are not worth our clinging onto. As long as you continue to visualize and practice on the nature of the 5 aggregates as emptiness in this way, they will be gradually restored to their state of oneness. Then, you can dismantle the traps and unlock the chains, and you can be liberated from the limitations of samsara. We have to visualize and practice deeply in this way. This kind of visualization practice method is called as the visualization practice method on the neither existence aspect of emptiness. It is not existent, and so it is called the aspect of neither existence. Emptiness has both aspects, namely, neither existence nor voidness. So this is a kind of visualization practice method on the aspect of neither existence. This is how to do the visualization. If you can visualize and practice in this way, you will be able to get rid of the control of the aggregate of form. Just like the ghost in the example that I gave earlier, if he stopped thinking about the building, and stopped thinking that he must have to find the door before he could leave. Do you know that a real body of the bardo, or a real ghost, can leave the building instantly by passing through the wall without using a door? He could, indeed, go through the wall. But in his aggregate of perceptions, all he told himself were, this is the door. This is the wall. I cannot walk through them. If I cannot find the staircase, there is no way I can get out of this building. When you tell yourself this for a long time, then you will really believe in it and so will not be able to get out. That was how he was being trapped. Therefore, while carrying out the visualization practice, we often have to tell ourselves that these 5 warehouses are just virtually existing and fictitious. They are not eternal, and they will change. They will always change. I should not cling onto them, and it is useless for me to cling onto them since they are always changing. Although I wish them to go my way, my karmic creditors will make them to go the other way, so I would rather ignore them altogether. If you can manage to do this, you can break this aggregate of form. We can surely break this through such kind of long-term visualization practices. If we can break the aggregate of form, that means we can also break away from its limitations. If we can break away from the limitations of the aggregate of form, we can then reduce our aggregate of sensations so that we can get rid of it more easily. As such, it will be easier for us to break away from the limitations of the aggregate of sensations as well. Again, we think further and go deeper about this warehouse of the aggregate of sensations, which is also just virtually existing and fictitious. It is just some feelings from our past lives. Similarly, it is all the same with the aggregate of perceptions. After you have broken away from its limitations, then your feelings are gone, and so you will not have so many things to think about. No matter how creative you are, you have to tell yourselves that this is unreal. This is all just virtually existing and fictitious. We should not have so many creative ideas, which are of no benefits to us in the final analysis. Now we must need to restore the state of oneness in order to really benefit us. Thus you can break the aggregate of perceptions, and so you can also break away from its limitations. Subsequently, without the first four aggregates, your behaviors of the body, speech, and mind will be reduced significantly. You can even replace them with some correct behaviors. Then, you can also break away from the limitations of the aggregate of mental formation gradually. After we have broken away from all these limitations, we can also break away from the limitations of our erroneous judgments in mental consciousness. And what remains is the kind of intrinsic awareness that can be attained. After we have broken away from so many limitations of the five aggregates, we would have made them to be ineffective. If we can further visualize and practice them to be the emptiness of oneness, then they will no longer have any influence upon us. This kind of visualization practice method is known as the visualization practice method on the neither existence aspect of emptiness, that is, the five aggregates do not really exist. They are empty. However, when I taught you how to initiate the programming and entering into the Dharma realm from the first to the fifth sessions, I have already said that in the state of oneness, we have to realize and know everything. It does not mean that we do not have any realizing and knowing at all, neither is it that there is nothing at all. If you use the aspect of neither existence to visualize on everything, you will lose your balance, and you will even lose your realizing and knowing. Then you will be trapped in what we call as insensate voidness, that is, insensate means stubborn, voidness means you think that it is really empty. You will be trapped somewhere in the three realms, in which only thoughts exist, such as the formless realm. In the end, this is another limitation that traps you. That is, among the five aggregates, you have already broken the aggregate of form, the aggregate of sensations, and the aggregate of mental formation. But then your aggregate of consciousness, namely, your mental consciousness, still attaches with your aggregate of perceptions. Still thinking that everything should be empty, and thus feeling that all need to be emptied, even with your ability of realizing and knowing. As a result, you will be trapped in a place lacking of realizing and knowing, without the kind of realizing and knowing of the perfect enlightenment that has no deviations. You will still be trapped by both the aggregate of consciousness and the aggregate of perceptions. You have broken 3 of the 5 aggregates, but you could not break these remaining 2, and so you will still be trapped in the formless realm. So, what do we have? We should have the realizing and knowing of oneness, which is all-pervasiveness. As I have explained earlier, because it is only one point, and so it is all-pervasiveness. It has no limitations. If you come to connect with another point, then 2 points will be connected together, and you will immediately be confined to one line. But if you do not have a connection, there will only be one point, the state of oneness, and it will have no limitations. This kind of visualization method is called the visualization practice method on the nor-voidness aspect of neither existence nor voidness. The visualization method of emptying the 5 aggregates is called the visualization practice method on the aspect of neither existence. While the visualization method of integrating your realizing and knowing into the state of oneness with all-pervasiveness is called the visualization practice method on the aspect of nor-voidness. Thus, practicing the visualization methods on both aspects of neither existence and nor-voidness together in a balancing way is called the true and genuine visualization practice method of emptiness. So, when someone asks you what is emptiness, what will be the answer? Emptiness is called neither existence nor voidness. What is neither existence? It is to visualize the 5 aggregates as emptiness. What is nor voidness? Nor voidness means that there is realizing and knowing, which is in the state of realizing and knowing of oneness and is all-pervasiveness. Thus, the combination of both aspects is called the real and genuine emptiness. So we have to remember this. Emptiness means neither existence plus nor voidness. It can help us to restore the realizing and knowing of the perfect enlightenment, which is our absolute bodhicitta, the highest level of bodhicitta. That will enable us to stay in the Dharma realm. This is the oral pith instruction of the Heart Sutra, which says, 1 should visualize, illuminate and perceive the very nature of the 5 aggregates is emptiness. But you will find that the Heart Sutra does not have this part. So what is missing? In the state of oneness we must maintain our realizing and knowing of oneness and achieve all-pervasiveness. It is this part of visualization practice on the aspect of nor-voidness that is missing in the Heart Sutra. The entire Heart Sutra only has the visualization practice method on the aspect of neither existence in it. There is no visualization practice method on the aspect of nor-voidness in it. This explains why so many people have practiced the Heart Sutra for hundreds of millions of kalpas and yet they have all failed. Why? Simply because they have lacked something, or missing part of it. Why is there something missing? As an epitome of the 600 volumes of the Mahaprajnaparamita Sutra, why was the Heart Sutra missing a part? I do not know why, but I can tell you that this part has been described in other Buddhist sutras. When I explain other Buddhist sutras in the future, I will add back this nor-voidness part for you. But now, since I am still explaining the Diamond Sutra, of course I will finish it first before going into other sutras. So, I will not talk about other sutras for the time being. So, in short, if you only practice in accordance to the Heart Sutra, you can only succeed in visualizing the aspect of neither existence but not the aspect of nor-voidness, I am sorry to say. You can never be able to stay in or enter into the Dharma realm. But you will know what is in the Dharma realm, and you will know what it is like in the state of the Dharma realm. Why? Because the Heart Sutra has already told you that. As you can see, the Heart Sutra explains the visualization practice method on how to stay in the Dharma realm. It says that as long as we can visualize the very nature of the five aggregates is emptiness, and by emptying the five warehouses of the five aggregates, so as to restore back to the state of oneness, we can then be able to stay in the Dharma realm. The Heart Sutra has explained to you the state of the Dharma realm. Once you understand what it is like, then you will know better as to how to stay there. The Diamond Sutra talks about the 18 realms. It says that you should not abide anywhere in the 18 realms. Instead, you should only stay in the state of oneness and do not abide in notions. This sutra mainly talks about the 18 chains. When you are collecting information, you have to handle those information carefully and try to incorporate them into the visualization practice method of entering into the Dharma realm, before you can unlock these 18 chains. This is what the Diamond Sutra is teaching you. Therefore, the Heart Sutra is an explanation of the state of oneness when you are in the Dharma realm. It is a practice that trains you on to how to stay in the Dharma realm, and so it focuses on the five aggregates to explain. On the contrary, the Diamond Sutra explains that while you are still in the dualistic or multiplistic states of the three realms, how you should train your Dharma practice in your daily life so that you can more easily enter into the Dharma realm. And then in matching with the Heart Sutra, you will then be able to stay in the Dharma realm. Therefore, the Diamond Sutra mainly talks about the 18 realms, and how we can unlock these 18 chains, in order to help us to enter into the Dharma realm. After entering into the Dharma realm, we need to act in concert with the Heart Sutra, so as to empty the five aggregates, in order to make these five warehouses disappeared. Then, we can be able to stay in the Dharma realm. Therefore, one is talking about staying, while the other is talking about entering. How to remove these 18 realms, that is, these 18 chains. Only by unlocking these 18 chains can you be able to enter into the Dharma realm. After entering into the Dharma realm, how can you stay in it? You must have to visualize the nature of the five aggregates as emptiness before you can be able to stay there. As the Heart Sutra says, hence, there is no form in emptiness. No sensation, perception, mental formation, and consciousness. It says that in emptiness there is no such thing as material substances, nor are there the five aggregates of perceptions, sensation, that is, feelings, thoughts, behaviors, and mental consciousness. None of these five aggregates exist. This is saying that there are no five aggregates. That is, this whole sentence explains that there are no five aggregates in the Dharma realm. You must have to empty these five aggregates, and to restore them back to the state of oneness. Otherwise, if you are not able to do it, then you will fall back out of the Dharma realm, and will not be able to attain Buddhahood. No sense organs of eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mental construct. These are the 6 sense organs that I have explained earlier, that is, the 6 roots. There are no such 6 sense organs in the Dharma realm, neither are there the functions of these 6 roots. As such, there are no sensations of form, sound, odor, taste, tactile sensation, and phenomena. In other words, there are no pollutions from these 6 dusts. No elements of I element, up to and including no element of mind consciousness. That is, all those functions of the eye element visual system, ear element auditory system, nose element olfactory system, and so on are all gone. At the same time, all but 6 consciousnesses, or the 6 identification functions of eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind, are all gone. So, this means that both the 5 aggregates and the 18 realms are all gone within the Dharma realm. The Heart Sutra says that there are no such things in the Dharma realm. Only when these things are all gone can we be able to stay in the Dharma realm. Hence, it is talking about how you can stay in the state of oneness of the Dharmic realm. But the Diamond Sutra is talking about how you can unlock these 18 chains. Therefore, there is quite a difference between these 2 sutras. So, if we want to unlock these chains of the 18 realms, what is the visualization practice method? The Diamond Sutra has taught us this: if you wish to become limitless, you have to use these 2 oral pith instructions, namely, should not abide anywhere, in order to restore it to the state of oneness, and do not abide in notions. These are the methods taught by the Diamond Sutra, in order to unlock these 18 chains. Then, you will have no limitations. Without these limitations, you will not be trapped in a building like that ghost, and you will not be trapped in the 3 realms. But this sutra has also talked about almsgiving. As you know, almsgiving is an act of accumulating merits. The Lord Buddha Shakyamuni especially used it as an example to illustrate the meanings of should not abide anywhere and do not abide in notions. That is to say, even if it is a virtuous karma and not an evil karma, it is still one of those chains of the 18 realms. Doing merit is also one of the chains which will make you to have an attachment, and then you will stay in these databases. But how should we apply do not abide in notions in our daily lives in order to remove the limitations of the 18 realms? This will be further explained with examples in each of the future sessions. This will not be explained today due to time constraints. Here, I would like to talk about the treasury of Dharmadhatu, which is the essence of oral pith instructions for practicing the Great Perfection Dzogchen, the highest Dharma practice of Tibetan Buddhism. It was compiled by Khunkyen Longchen Rabjam, one of the great lineage masters of our Nying Marpa Red sect who specialized in the practice of the Great Perfection. These are the collection of the oral pith instructions from the 17 Dzogchen Tantras, which are the oral pitch instructions of the 17 uncommon kinds of pragmatic practice methods that are unique from all the other schools. It is that part of the Great Perfection that describes the methods of a firm approach in cutting through the solidity of elusive reality by direct crossing, Thogel, in Tibetan. That is, it describes those practice methods that we can use to firmly cut through the attachment of some solidity, as well as to cut off our graspings onto all the notions, in order to restore our Dharma nature, and our bodhicitta of the perfect enlightenment. In the Treasury of Dharmadhatu, there is a section entitled Descriptions on How Conditions Manifest, which is no different from emptiness as they are crystal clear and pure. What is it about? I will explain now. What does it mean to manifest because of conditions? But, in fact, they are no different from emptiness, as they are crystal clear and pure. This is how this section starts. First, all sufferings and happiness are the manifestations of awareness, which is the principle of how nature operates. This is talking about the aggregate of sensations. His Holiness Kyabje Chadrol Sangidorya Rinpoche had written an article to advise Dharma practitioners. In the advice article, he stated in a sentence, sufferings and happiness are just psychological feelings, but they are not real. In fact, this is just the law of causes and effects, and there is nothing else to exist. Actually, there is nothing that exists other than the law of causes and effects. These are a kind of feeling, and they are unreal. His advice can be used to correctly describe what we are talking about just now, that is, All sufferings and happiness are the manifestations of awareness, which is the principle of how nature operates. In fact, what does it mean? I will explain it now. Actually, sufferings and happiness are all caused by karmic forces. They are constantly ever-changing and are not real. What is not real? You are yelling in pain, and so, how can this be unreal? You may say, I am suffering from cancer, and I am about to die. I have to take painkillers because of the pain. How can you say that this is unreal? I say that this is very real indeed. In fact, this is caused by your karmic forces. One day the karmic retribution will be over, and then it will be changed to something else. If the karmic retribution is not yet over, but you do have some virtuous karmas appearing at that time, then you may become cured, or it will be changed to something else again. Or, maybe after you have repented, your karmic creditors finally are willing to forgive you. Then, your cancer might be healed automatically. In fact, your suffering is not real, eternal, and immutable. This is what is meant by unreal. It is not real in this sense. But you really have a feeling. This is your psychological feeling. But what caused it? It is the result of causes and effects. It is caused by your karmic forces, with your karmic creditors harassing you. This is how karma works. Where there is a cause, there will be an effect. You guess you would not feel any sufferings. For example, you are constantly pestered by cancer, feeling excruciatingly painful indeed. Do you think that if you keep yelling in pain, will the pain disappear immediately? No, it will not. It is the same with happiness. If something makes you happy, then happiness will continue to emerge. If you tell yourself all day long, I do not want to be happy. I want to be unhappy. Will you be unhappy then? That kind of happiness might diminish a little, but it will not disappear instantly. It is just in the process of change, as you have added in a force there. However, if it is the force of some karmic creditors who seek for revenge against you, it will be much harder to be resolved. Those of your grateful debtors, who wish to requite the debts of gratitude they owe you, will make you feel happy. But, if you ask them not to make you so happy, they will definitely listen to you and will not give you that kind of happiness. Then, this happiness will immediately be reduced a lot. But if you are yelling in pain, because your karmic creditors want you to suffer, so they will add another force to make you feel even more painful. This tells us one thing: if you are not able to alleviate your karmic force due to the feeling, sufferings, or happiness, then it is best for you to visualize these feelings as emptiness and try not to stay focused on them. Do not abide in notions means that you should not abide in the scenes of those states. Do not focus all day long on the fact that you have cancer. If you quite often keep on thinking that you have cancer and will soon die, then you will really die quickly. However, there have been some cases like this. Some people were diagnosed with cancer, and there are many similar cases on the internet. But he simply chose to ignore it, because he was going to die soon, and so he sold all his assets to avoid trouble. Then he used all his money to travel around the world, in trying to pursue the happiest things for himself. After his travel all over the world, his illness had been cured without medications. This shows one thing: though these are just our feelings, if we keep focusing on them, we will only make things worse. That is, if you keep telling yourself all day long that you have cancer, your focus will stay on the cancer. Then you will abide in notions. This will only exacerbate your feelings. The warehouse of your aggregate of sensations will be continually expanded. There will have more and more things inside it, and you will become more and more painful. But, in fact, you cannot get rid of them. The meaning of this sentence is that since you already knew that it is unreal, sooner or later it will change, and so you should not abide with it. Otherwise, you will only exacerbate the situation. In fact, this is a kind of the law of causes and effects. There is nothing else other than that. It will disappear after the dissolution of the causes and effects. On the contrary, if I focus on other situations, like that person who had cancer who turned his attention from cancer to traveling around the world. He sold all his assets to release his bindings. He told himself, if I leave my assets here, I do not know who can inherit my assets. I am also afraid of unsuccessful selling in the future, so I might as well sell my assets now and use up the money, without any more troubles. As such, he did not care any more about his upcoming death. Thus, he went on with his travels and just enjoyed his life. Therefore, his concentration had turned to his virtuous karmas. There are two kinds of combinations in our karmic portfolios: virtuous karmas and evil karmas. If you are thinking all day that you are in pain and suffering from cancer, then you are focusing on the part of the evil karmas, resulting in more and more of your evil karmas to appear. Because the tractional force of your mind has been continuously focusing on them, then your evil karmas will appear more and more. It is you who have triggered them. On the contrary, if your tractional force focus on selling all the assets, so that I can go to travel. I want to be happy. I want to have fun. That means your tractional force have focused on that part of the virtuous karmas, which will then trigger more virtuous karmas to appear. Therefore, his illness soon recovered. Will everyone succeed then? It all depends on the amount of virtuous karmas that you have, whether you can convert those evil karmas into virtuous karmas, or whether you can suppress those evil karmas so that they could only appear later. These are, indeed, quite different for everyone, but some people could really succeed because they do have sufficient amounts of virtuous karmas and have enough concentration as well. He had a firm determination, sold all their assets, and then went on to travel around the world. As a result, he recovered. That is to say, actually sufferings and happiness are a kind of feeling. Do not focus on them and strengthen this aggregate of sensations. If you strengthen it, you will be in trouble. That is, you have added in some new causes. Then, but your evil retributions would be increased by you, not by your karmic creditors but by yourself. This is really not good. Therefore, you must remember this. Our karmic forces also include the existing feelings that had resulted from the influences of the 5 aggregates upon our own minds. Why is it that our karmic forces are the law of causes and effects? These karmic forces include the 5 aggregates, which have been explained just now. They will have influences upon your mind. Therefore, you will generate an existing feeling. This kind of existing feeling will continue to either increase or decrease, depending on how you visualize it. If you have resistance or craving for those sufferings and happiness, you'll crave for happiness and will resist sufferings. Then you will never be able to cut off the influences and constraints of karmic forces. Why? Because you have added in some newest causes for yourself. You have added in some more of your own concentrations and tractional forces, thus letting these tractional forces to further increase the evil karmas from your karmic portfolio. You must surely die. Therefore, we should not let these influences and constraints to continue due to our own entanglements. If we do not abide in notions, if we do not dwell on those existing feelings, then it is equivalent to our not being entangled. No entanglement means no continuation. No continuation means no strengthening. No strengthening means waiting for them to slowly dissipate on their own. If we can understand that the source of sufferings and happiness is coming from some rapidly changing causes and effects, and since it is the law of causes and effects, it will change sooner or later. Although when you are in pain, you might feel that the pain dissipates very slowly. But then, one day it will definitely disappear. If you do not resist or crave, if you do not focus on them, you will easily restore your awareness. You will then recognize that all sufferings and happiness are the manifestations of awareness, which is the principle of how nature operates. Please look at this sentence highlighted in red. All sufferings and happiness are the manifestations of awareness, which is the principle of how nature operates. What does it mean? It means that as long as we can recognize and know that happiness and sufferings are just some rapidly changing causes and effects, so that we do not resist or crave, nor do we pay any attention to them. Just like we do not stir up the beer foam with a spoon, then we can easily be able to restore our awareness. Then we can understand one thing. All sufferings and happiness are just manifestations of awareness, which is the principle of how nature operates, and so it means that you should not be too serious about them. This sentence is about the aggregate of sensations. This explanation also answered a question from one of my disciples. who specially wrote an email to ask me because he did not understand the meaning of this sentence that His Holiness Kyabje Chadral Sangidorya Rinpoche had said. Hence, I specially explained this sentence in more details. Next, the second sentence is by keeping attachments going back and forth between acceptance or rejection. Would mean being tied up in the three realms. This sentence is talking about the aggregate of mental formation. Acceptance means grasping or attachments. The three kinds of existences mean the three realms. That is to say, if you persist in and attach to the owning of all your things, undecided as to whether to take them or not, these are kind of either acceptance or rejection, or some kind of judgment, such that you are wavering back and forth in between these two ends. Your grasping onto either of them will definitely tie you up in the three realms, and then you just could not escape. All these kinds of behaviors in either accepting or rejecting of yours, with your clinging on and attaching to either wanting or not wanting, will make you to become trapped in the three realms, as these are the dualistic and or multiplistic states. All manifestations of a phenomenon are coming from the awareness of the six sense roots with their collected information. This is talking about the aggregate of form, that is, the material substances, all the scenes, forms, and situations that you can see, that is the manifestations of all the notions of form, are actually some of the information being collected by some of your root gates, that is, your six sense roots. Actually, these are just some phenomena that manifest in your root gates. In fact, they are all manifested by our awareness, which is some kind of luminosity. Luminosity means light, or something being manifested by a kind of crystal clarity of awareness. If you understand this truth, you will not be trapped, nor abide by these notions of form, or their manifestations. All manifestations of a phenomena are coming from the mind as simply memories without a trace. This is talking about the aggregate of perceptions. In fact, all those things that we have manifested, those scenes that we have often thought of in our minds, all those images that were being projected by our minds were simply scenes or things that were brought out by our thoughts. In fact, they were simply our memories and thoughts in your database of the aggregate of perceptions. They were simply some phenomena that were manifested by past memories in the database of the aggregate of perceptions. In fact, you should make them without a trace, that is, you should not treat them and place them there as traceable information. You should simply treat them as if they have never happened, nor have ever been existed at all. You should regard their essential nature as emptiness, and only then can they be called without a trace. That is the correct way to practice. That is how you should practice and visualize on the aggregate of perceptions. Now it comes to the aggregate of consciousness. Both the dissipation and manifestation of a phenomenon happened occasionally, yet they become the bondages. Is a kind of manifestation or dissipation. In fact, this is a kind of breakage, or establishment. Establishment is manifestation, while breakage is dissipation. All these phenomena, whether they manifest or dissipate, are actually the bondages to us. We should not focus on them, especially as these manifestations or dissipations are of dualistic and or multiplistic nature. They are also something that happened by chance. Occasionally means they happened by chance. Regardless of their manifestation, breakage, establishment, or dissipation, these are all the states of manifestation due to the dependent origination of causes and conditions. That is, everything arises exclusively due to and dependent upon the coincidence of causes and conditions without which they cannot possibly appear. They happened by chance, depending upon the different causes and conditions, and they will not exist eternally without changing. We should not be subject to these bondages in affecting our mental consciousness. So this is talking about the aggregate of consciousness. In actuality, all manifestations do not have a real and eternal foundation. This means that, in fact, all these manifestations do not have a real, eternal, and unchanging foundation. Everything arises or manifests as due to the dependent origination of causes and conditions. That is, all these manifestations are the function of dependent origination, Sanskrit, pratityasamutpada. All scenes which appear in sequences and then dissolve are themselves traceless in nature. This means that all scenes, regardless of whether they continue to appear in order, or whether they would be destroyed and disillusioned later on, we must visualize them to be traceless. No information needs to be retained or existed in our databases in order to influence us. In short, they must be without any traces, and we must visualize their essential nature as emptiness. In other words, its very nature itself is emptiness, no matter how they manifest or decay. We must visualize and practice in this way. The best way for all sentient beings is to analyze with their mind, and yet it is simply like the sky. This is talking about the aspect of neither existence. In the minds of all sentient beings, the best way and highest method to analyze the phenomena is to treat them as the empty sky, which is the aspect of neither existence. When you visualize it as the aspect of neither existence, as if there is nothing in the empty sky. This is also a very good analytical method to help you to visualize the nature of the five aggregates as emptiness, or that dependent origination is emptiness in its very nature. But what else do we need to do for the best way? It is this aspect of nor voidness which is what you must have to do most fundamentally. All manifestations and the mind are of no difference, with both as pure as the empty sky. It means that all manifestations and your mind are of the same nature. In fact, they are all actually manifested by your own mind. Hence, you should merge them all into one, transforming all into the state of oneness, as the pure empty sky. It is a state of oneness which are not two different things, or something that belongs to a dualistic or multiplistic state. We should not treat the manifestations as manifestations, nor my mind as my mind. Instead, both the manifestations and my mind should be united into the state of oneness as non-duality. You have to visualize them in this way. In other words, what does this talk about? All manifestations and the mind are non-dual is, in fact, talking about the realizing and knowing of oneness in the state of oneness. This realizing and knowing of oneness, intrinsic awareness, thus refers to the realizing and knowing of the perfect enlightenment. This sentence means that all of us have this realizing and knowing awareness. But this realizing and knowing is of the state of oneness which is as pure as the empty sky, without the existence of any deviations or pollutions. We call this all manifestations and the mind are non-dual. That is talking about the state of the visualization practice method on the aspect of nor voidness. The Heart Sutra mentions that we should visualize and practice on the nature of the five aggregates as emptiness. It also talks about dependent origination is emptiness in its very nature. This sutra also includes the visualization practice method on the aspect of neither existence, but not that on the aspect of nor voidness. There is also no mention of the visualization practice method on the realizing and knowing of oneness in this sutra. Yet, it tells us the whole situation where there is neither the five aggregates, nor the 18 realms. Also, there is neither wisdom nor attainment. And there is nothing. It is on the aspect of neither existence. It talks about the aspect of neither existence in great details, but it does not talk about the aspect of nor voidness at all. If we can do these things, there are additional remarks in the Great Perfection to help supplement on the lack of some teachings. As mentioned before, if you can do these things as has previously been mentioned. That is, if you can visualize and practice on the nature of the five aggregates as emptiness, such that you can truly realize their very nature as emptiness, and understand that dependent origination is emptiness in its very nature. As well as knowing the visualization practice method on emptiness, neither existence nor voidness. It says that if you can do all these, that is, anyone who knows all these things as mentioned before will become the descendant of Samantabhadra. Samantabhadra refers to the Tathagata Samantabhadra of the primordial Dharmakaya Buddha. He is a Buddha in Dharmakaya, that is, in the state of oneness. He is the most primordial Buddha. It was he who propagated the truth of the state of oneness of the Dharma body Dharmakaya. So, as a result, many sentient beings later on could be able to learn and attain Buddhahood. Why can we now have the Buddhist holy Dharma? Why can we be able to understand this knowledge, and then later on many people can be able to attain Buddhahood? This is all because of the Tathagata Samantabhadra Dharmakaya Buddha, who was the first and the most primordial one to attain Buddhahood, and then passed on and spread the holy teachings. If you can grasp all the meanings of everything that I have mentioned, you are a direct descendant of his lineage, you are his own son, then you can definitely be able to attain Buddhahood, to become the Dharmakaya Buddha. Because you can fully understand how to visualize and recognize the Dharma nature, and so you are his direct descendant. This is what it means. This explains one thing: if we want to practice the Buddhist holy Dharma in order to attain Buddhahood, and if we want to restore our bodhicitta of perfect enlightenment, we must learn how to visualize and practice on the five aggregates to become the state of oneness, that is, we must have to visualize and practice on the nature of five aggregates as emptiness. We must have to understand that dependent origination is emptiness in its very nature. And we must know how to practice on neither existence nor voidness together in a balancing way, without missing any one of them in order to achieve the attainment. Only in this way can we be able to succeed. These are the whole picture of the oral pith instructions that can supplement the missing part of the Heart Sutra. Or that there are some methods taught in the Diamond Sutra that can help us in our visualization practice. Okay, that is all for today.